This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghanem.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we're back, full swing here. And there is so much news going on right now. We have a great show today. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about, the selectivity of the pro-Israel lobby here in the United States. We're going to talk a little bit about how selective they are in who they choose to support. And specifically, we're going to talk about RFK Jr. I mean, you can hear the sarcasm in my voice, but we'll get to that. We're also going to talk about a dramatic increase in illegal colonial Israeli settlers who've been unleashed under this new extremist apartheid government of Israel to drive out and continue the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and from their villages in the West Bank. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on that. And this is kind of a crazy story, Jamal, but people are celebrating Golda Meir. I mean, this was someone, former prime minister of the apartheid state, who really has so much blood on her hand, but they're rewriting the history books. We're going to talk a little bit about that too. But before we get that, we're going to watch a really great interview that you did with the editor of Tikun Olam, the blog, Richard Silverstein, who's going to talk about the recent visit of President Herzog and his visit to the U.S. and his message of peace to the Joint House of Congress and trying to rush to pass a resolution that, I mean, why do you have to pass a resolution? But they tried to pass a resolution about Israel not being a racist state. It's so crazy. But anyways.
So rule of thumb, Jess, if you are a racist state or an apartheid state, what do? You pass a resolution to say that you are not a racist state, an apartheid state. This is like asking a criminal to say, are you a criminal? Are you a drug dealer? Of course they're going to say no.
No, they're going to say, let's pass a resolution saying I'm not a drug dealer or criminal. I mean, if you're not, you don't need to pass a resolution. Anyways, we're going to talk about that.
Anyway, let's watch Richard Silverstein. Lately, politicians are parading their Zionist allegiance with urgency. Netanyahu's severe right government and dismantling of Israel's judicial system, along with ongoing oceans of angry protesters, does not showcase the shared democratic values President Biden likes to invoke in his allegiance to the Zionist state. With Israel in dire need of damage control, a more subdued President, Isaac Herzog, flew in to play good cop, meeting with Biden, then addressing a joint session of Congress on July 19th. When Pramila Jayapal, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, called Israel a racist state, and 9 members of Congress pledged to boycott Herzog's speech, the GOP doubled down and rushed a resolution through the House declaring the state of Israel is not a racist or apartheid state. Meanwhile, in a rite of political passage, Robert Kennedy Jr. is being mentored by Rabbi Shmuley, the self-proclaimed America's rabbi. He supports controversial figures at odds with the American Jewish community in exchange for their supporting Israel. Kennedy's talking points are now rife with vicious lies about Palestinians and praise for Israel. Joining us to discuss this and more is Richard Silverstein. He authors the Tikun Olam blog, which is devoted to exposing the human rights abuses committed by the Israeli National Security State. His work has appeared in Haaretz, The Forward, the Seattle Times, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications. Welcome back to Arab Talk, Richard.
Thank you for having me, Jamal. I appreciate it.
Biden is temporarily snubbing Netanyahu, so Herzog flew into Washington for sorely needed damage control for Israel. Herzog was expected to close the widening rift between governments resulting from all the violent imagery in Israel. What was the expectation, and do you think he met it?
Well, I think that Biden's expectation was to show that he disapproved of Netanyahu because he has not invited Netanyahu to the White House, which is a break with White House and presidential tradition, which calls for an Israeli prime minister to be invited almost immediately after a president takes office. I think that the expectation would be to give Herzog the good housekeeping seal of approval from the U.S. government, because Herzog has the reputation of being a moderate, in scare quotes, and someone who opposes Netanyahu, opposes his judicial coup, and who has a reputation of being a liberal Zionist. However, the speech that Herzog gave to Congress presented Israel as a lie. It presented an Israel that is courageous, that is liberal, that is humane, and tried to suggest that the Netanyahu government doesn't really represent the true Israel. And as we know, that is false. And Herzog has been trying to broker a compromise between the opposition, sort of center-right opposition, and the Likud junta. And he's failed at that. So, and the idea that he would say that, or the Congress would say that Israel is not an apartheid state is ludicrous, because 3 internationally distinguished human rights groups have written reports saying that it's not only an apartheid state, but from the river to the sea, which includes all of the West Bank and Gaza.
Talk about Jay Paul, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, calling Israel a racist state, and the scramble to pass a resolution before Herzog arrived.
Well, Pramila Jayapal is a member of Congress who actually represents my district here in Seattle. And as I said, she's an Indian American, and she is known for being progressive. It's very dangerous, though, for anyone, including progressives, to take a stance that is too critical of Israel. And at Netroots Nation conference in Chicago, which was protested by pro-Palestinian activists, she tried to mollify them by saying to the crowd that Israel was a racist state. In that crowd, that was something that was appropriate, because the crowd, the pro-Palestinian activists, by the way, many of whom are Jewish and some are Israeli, did address their concerns. But there was, of course, a backlash in Congress, and not just from the GOP, by the way, from also many Democrats demanded that she retract that statement. It's interesting to know that in response, she didn't retract the statement. Although she did say that she didn't mean to say that the Israeli state was racist, but the Israeli government was racist. And that's a distinction without a difference, since the Israeli government represents the state and is, for all intents and purposes, the state. So she made a distinction, as I said, without a difference in doing that. And it did seem to tamp down the furor over what she did. And as I mentioned, the subsequent vote saying that Israel was not an apartheid state just flies in the face of the reality in Israel, the reality for Palestinians on the West Bank, and anyone with eyes in their head who is watching the news and seeing the images come out of the fires burning in Palestinian villages set by Israeli extremist settlers confirms that Israel is even worse than a racist state that's engaged, I would say, in genocide, if not worse.
Well, if you're not an apartheid state or a racist state, do you need a resolution to prove it? Isn't it obvious?
Well, the reason why the resolution was promoted was that the members of Congress needed to mollify the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby would be outraged by statements like Jayapal's, and probably she has political ambitions to run for a U.S. Senate seat as soon as one is open in Washington. So she has to be concerned about the pro-Israel donors who she probably would need to run a race like that. So there's a huge backlash from the Israel lobby. And by the way, in the last Democratic election cycle, the lobby spent $30 million trying to defeat Democratic candidates in primaries, not the general election, but in primaries. And all of that money came from right-wing, pro-Israel Republican billionaires. So we have this strange political theater going on where the Republicans are intervening in Democratic primaries to defeat progressive Democratic candidates.
I mean, so many politicians want to get kudos for supporting Israel. For example, we have Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence's Christians United for Israel. Who are they pitching to?
Well, they're pitching to donors in the Israel lobby, as I mentioned, who they need, even though they're Republicans, they need these right-wing pro-Israel donors as well. And they are largely billionaire Wall Street hedge fund managers and the like, and they put their money where their mouth and where their political sympathies lie, supporting both Democrats and Republicans, but only Democrats who toe the line of the Israel lobby, who support Israeli policies right down the line, and who are never, ever willing to criticize anything by Israel that Israel does.
Meanwhile, some actual Jewish Israel supporters are more critical of Israel than these Christian cheerleaders in many cases. For example, circling back to J.R. Paul, pro-Israel journalist David Rothkopf states the shame that so few in Congress are willing to call Israel the racist state it is. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, I think what's interesting about David Rothkopf is that he comes out of a pro-Israel tradition and pro-Israel thinking. He was the managing director of Kissinger and Associates, and we know about Kissinger's political leanings, and he's rebelled against that. And for the last few years, he's been writing devastating attacks on the Israeli state, and he called for the U.S. government to stop funding Israel, period, to stop the $38 billion 10-year deal that Obama signed, giving Israel nearly $4 billion a year to buy U.S. military hardware. And it's quite radical for anyone on the Washington sort of circuit scene to call for an end to U.S. military aid. And by the way, our leading national progressive Democrat, Bernie Sanders, doesn't even go that far. He calls for reducing U.S. military aid and sort of punishing Israel as long as it violates international law.
Or conditioning it to meet certain criteria.
Conditioning it to Israel adhering to human rights provisions and the Leahy Law, which calls on the U.S. government to stop aid to any country that's deemed to be authoritarian. So, not just Rothkopf, by the way. Two former U.S. ambassadors to Israel, Kurtzer and one other whose name I'm losing in my mind here. But anyway, they're both former AIPAC affiliated think tank analysts, and they too called for ending U.S. military aid to Israel. So I think that there is a sea change going on, especially among Democrats. By the way, a Gallup poll found for the first time that more Democrats support Palestine than Israel. And this too marks a major change, and it's influenced by the increasing radical right-wing racist nature of the Israeli government and its policies. So as Israel becomes more and more right-wing, the approach of Americans becomes more and more left-wing. So I think that's an important process to note.
On the same theme of jockeying to get Israel Zionist creds, Then you have Robert Kennedy Jr. running for president. He's pivoted 180 degrees from the beginning of his campaign when he supported Roger Waters. Then he did some crazy free associating racist COVID conspiracy rambling. Then you have Rabbi Shmuley, who has taken him in hand. What is America's so-called rabbi modus operandi?
Well, Rabbi Shmuley sort of latches on to various celebrities who he considers himself a celebrity rabbi. He wrote a book called Kosher Sex. He's an Orthodox rabbi who was formerly affiliated with Chabad, a right-wing pro-Israel religious movement, and he was booted out of Chabad because he went in a different direction in terms of his theological views. And his endorsement, he endorses sort of any celebrity who is pro-Israel or he can put on a pro-Israel platform. In the past, he's awarded a Human Rights Award to Sean Penn. The award was given by Sheldon Adelson, which is ironic. You have, he's deceased now, Sheldon Adelson, but he used to fund not just the Republican presidential candidates, but he once said that Palestine doesn't exist, and he called for bombing Iran, and Sean Penn was willing to go on to an event that Shmuley organized and giving him a Human Rights Award. So let's now switch to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is what I would call a flat earther, someone who denies science, denies COVID vaccines. He's always been anti-vax in general, but for COVID in particular. And he said during that interview that you mentioned that COVID was designed specifically by China to avoid harming Chinese or Asian individuals and Jews.
Ashkenazi Jews. He said.
Ashkenazi Jews, right. Yeah. Because, of course, Ashkenazi Jews are the vast majority of Jews in America. So it clearly had anti-Semitic dog whistle overtones. And in terms of Israel, Kennedy has really endorsed not just a right-wing view of Israeli politics, but I would say sort of on the far extreme of right-wing views, even more extreme than many Republicans are. And so he accepted this interview with Shmuley because he desperately wants to show that he is pro-Israel and that he can get funding from pro-Israel donors.
I mean, he's going pro-Israel more than extremist Zionist who would go pro-Israel. I mean, he's making up stuff like saying Israel does not target Palestinian civilians. They only target military, and doesn't mention, for example, the death of American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh and the children that get killed in Gaza. And just the other day, 16-year-old child was shot. So he's just like working extra hard to prove something. That's why I'm saying there's more to it than just like befriending Rabbi Shmuley.
Well, I think each one has something that they need to gain from being together. Shmuley wants to continue this notion that he likes controversy. He likes to sort of push the edge of the envelope. And if
just quickly now, a thought came in my mind. Wasn't Shmuley involved in trying to exonerate Michael Jackson from being a pedophile at one point?
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, that's what I meant by embracing celebrities. So any celebrity he can embrace, he will sort of whitewash whatever crimes they might commit or whatever outrages they might say, like Kennedy. And Kennedy himself needs the imprimatur of someone like Rabbi Shmuley, because Rabbi Shmuley has access to pro-Israel donors like Sheldon Adelson. So they're both sort of helping each other and allowing each other to exploit their opposite number, and they both get something that they need from it. So it's a transaction really rather than any kind of real sort of affinity of values, I would say.
Do you think that one way or another, to be a viable political candidate in the U.S., you must be vetted by your allegiance to Israel?
I think that's true. I think that we've seen all presidential candidates, especially Democrats, have to pledge their allegiance to Israel. They go on junkets to Israel that are paid for by AIPAC and affiliate groups affiliated with AIPAC. The leading Democrat in the House of Representatives basically said that he aimed to sort of strip the Progressive Caucus of any power. Hakeem Jeffries, I'm talking about, who is an African American from serving in Brooklyn.
He, by the way, just recently said that Jerusalem is a borough of New York City.
That's right. He did. He did. But of course, he represents a Jewish district, largely Jewish district in Brooklyn. So he himself needs to toe the line. And even progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the leading progressive members of Congress, she voted against a $500 million military appropriation for Israel. And then she had to backpedal, and she voted in favor of the appropriation with literally tears in her eyes, trying to explain how a progressive could support military aid to Israel. So even someone like her, who is a shining light for progressive Democrats like us, I don't want to speak for you, but progressive Democrat like me. So even they have to toe the line. And these are the most progressive, most left-wing members of Congress.
Well, you could call me a progressive Democrat. There is no shame in that. So do you think there will be a continued fallout from Netanyahu's latest maneuvers, or will our so-called shared democratic values just be replaced by pressure from lobbies and more money?
Well, I think that there is a huge amount of pressure on Biden to do more, to be more outspoken. He has been feeble, really, in his expressions of concern, in quotes, for what's going on in Israel. He has said that he's called and spoken to Netanyahu and told him to stop with the judicial overhaul. But he's done nothing that was really serious. And this is one of the criticisms of David Rothkopf. He says that the U.S. needs to be more muscular, more aggressive, more assertive, and telling Israel that it must stop what it's doing and that there will be repercussions if it doesn't do so. And he's not been willing to do that. He's only been willing to do symbolic acts like inviting Herzog to speak to a joint session of Congress and denying Bibi this coveted visit to the White House. And by the way, and Netanyahu announced after a phone conversation with Biden that he had been invited to the White House, and Biden and the State Department had to say, well, yes, he's been invited, but it won't be until the end of the year, and it won't be at the White House, they'll be at the United Nations. So he's really Biden is trying to nibble around the edges rather than getting right at the heart of the issue. And you just can't do that anymore. It doesn't satisfy anyone in America, and especially those Democrats who are now pro-Palestine. It doesn't satisfy anyone. So I think that in Congress and in the Senate, there is sort of a beginning of being a change and transformation of Democratic senators and Congress members towards being more muscular, more outspoken. But it hasn't yet come up to the top of presidential races and Democrats who are running for president.
You monitor the Hebrew press, and I'm talking about the Hebrew press, Israeli press, but actually the one that's written in Hebrew, not just like the ones that's published in English, like Haaretz in English and so forth. Is there a difference in the messaging that what people read here or kind of what politicians say, like Benjamin Netanyahu when he comes on American TV, which, by the way, he hasn't been granted too many interviews on Israeli TV, but yet he comes here and he's unchallenged, can speak for 15, 20 minutes. And then the difference in that, what he says when he gets interviewed in Hebrew.
Well, there is a difference, a marked difference, because Netanyahu is in a far right-wing coalition. It's not just Likud. They're the moderates in the coalition government right now. You have Bezalel Smotrich, you have Itamar Ben-Gvir. These are former Jewish terrorists who have attacked and attacked Palestinians for decades, really, and made their sort of career out of being militant, homicidal terrorists against Palestinians. So Netanyahu has to curry favor with that far-right coalition. He knows that when he goes on U.S. TV and does those media interviews that you're talking about, he has to present a more moderate approach. And so he tells an American audience that this is really a democratic reform because the voice of the Knesset is the only legitimate democratic voice in Israel. And he doesn't talk about wanting to neuter the Supreme Court and to eliminate checks and balances by the judicial branch and by the Attorney General, who's an independent figure right now in the Israeli government. He doesn't talk about that because he knows that will not be, our audience will not be receptive. And he refuses to do most interviews with Israeli media because he knows that he'll be taken, held to account by Israeli journalists, that they will be sharper in their criticism and bring up contradictions in what he is saying. And the Israeli media protest this loudly, that he refuses to be held to account by Israeli media. And to a large extent, the U.S. Interviewers who interview him don't really know what's going on in Israel, don't really understand the political fire that's really burning in Israel when you have hundreds of thousands of protesters calling for a return of democracy, mostly Israeli Jewish protesters. But these interviewers really can be snowed under by this sort of moderate facade that Netanyahu puts up when he's talking to media sources here.
So what is his end game, or at least this government's end game, aside from eliminating this whole judicial system there? And I'm talking about vis-a-vis the Palestinians, because talks about complete annexation is the plan. I mean, is this what is being discussed at least in the conservative Israeli media, where most of the Kahanists use it as a pulpit?
Well, yes, annexation, I think, is really almost the first step. They want to essentially eliminate Palestinians. It's what some people have called creeping annexation or creeping apartheid, where they eventually want to expel Palestinians. They won't be able to expel Israeli Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, but they will be able to expel Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza if they choose to do that. They don't talk about what they call population transfer, which is a euphemism for expulsion. But they don't talk about that because they know that would be frowned on and opposed in the international community. But that's one of the things they want to do. And part of this process is to set the settlers loose on the Palestinian towns and villages that are adjacent to the settlements. And that's why the village of Huara was assaulted, and a pogrom that settlers did there, and in which they burned vehicles, and they even burned houses in which Palestinians were inside the houses. They tried to burn them down. At least one person was murdered in that. And there was another pogrom that happened a few days ago in which settlers rampaged through it. I think the village was called Burqa. They also murdered a Palestinian in that incident. And the guns that the settlers were using were provided by the military, and the military protected the settlers on a rampage. And then the hypocrisy of it is that the IDF chief of staff goes on media and says that this was an excess that the military should have stopped it and that it will stop it in the future. But the reality is that they not only don't stop it, but they protect the settlers, and they also attack Palestinians who are trying to resist, show any form of resistance. And then Israelis are shocked when Palestinians who are engaging in armed resistance attack Israeli settlers, and they feign shock when this happens, and they call them terrorists. When they believe that the IDF and the settlers are kosher citizens, good citizens of the state of Israel. So it's really pure, unadulterated hypocrisy. And this really informs the Israeli government and its policies and what it intends for Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza.
Richard Silverstein, thank you again for coming on Arab Talk, and hope to talk to you soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Jamal.
That's the voice and the face of Richard Silverstein. He's the editor of the blog of Tikun Olam, talking about this crazy visit with President Herzog of the apartheid Israeli state. You know, as our listeners and viewers know, there was this big push by the Progressive Democratic Caucus to boycott that because Israel is, in fact, a racist apartheid state. And the Democrats and the Republicans, you know, shaking and quaking in their boots, you know, not wanting to cross the apartheid state and its leadership, so they tried to pass that resolution that Israel is not a racist state. But I think Richard Silverstein makes a lot of interesting points, you know, from the perspective of the progressive Jewish point of view.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying all different gimmicks to say, well, the first gimmick, of course, is the good cop, bad cop, because now they realize their darling Benjamin Netanyahu is persona non grata by the administration to begin with, and of course by the international community. So what did they do this time? They bring the president, who really, you know, with all fairness, he has no political
authority
weight,
or
power there, but still he represents an apartheid state, and he is, of course, now the good cop. So let's now we're gonna shun the bad cop Benjamin Netanyahu until later on, until everybody forgets about him, you know, because you know, there are rumors that he was invited. One time here he was invited for later and was not invited. But anyway, eventually I'm sure he'll resurface back in the United States. Anyway, so they bring the so-called good cop, Herzog, President Herzog, to whitewash basically the Israeli apartheid and Israeli crimes, and regurgitate the same talking points. Now, you know, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. We're going through some democratic transition. We've extended our hands to the Palestinians, but they don't want peace. We want to protect ourselves against terror. You know, the whole, you know, enchilada, as they say, of lies.
The same talking points for decades. This is
the same talking points, and sadly, Israel surrogate in Congress, they line up as usual to pay homage. Now, remember, the last time Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint session of Congress, it was a slap in the face of President Obama. He circumvented the president and got invited by the Congress at the same. Imagine, this is the greatest country, at least this is how Americans look at it, in the world, that you have a leader of a financial aid recipient country, a country that actually relies on U.S. support, both militarily, politically, and financially, circumvent the administration, the president, the State Department, and goes and addresses the joint session of Congress. This was Benjamin Netanyahu's last gimmick. They couldn't do it with him this time, so they brought Herzog. This is I'm oversimplifying the story, Jesse.
No, it's actually not too much of an oversimplification, but I think it's important to at least put out on the table that there are some shifts. You had a group of progressive Democrats who at least called out and decided to boycott and call out the apartheid Israeli state for what it is, a racist apartheid state. They got a lot of press. Yes, Congresswoman Jayapal had to walk back that comment a little bit, but the topic of the apartheid state and Israel being a racist state and not a democratic state got a lot of attention in the media. So that part is good. And I think, this happened a few weeks ago, but there was an op-ed in the New York Times saying by Nick Kristof, who basically said, hey, maybe we need to reevaluate. He said it in the kind of most bland terms possible. Maybe we should reevaluate our aid to this apartheid state, not because it's a racist state, not because it's an apartheid state, but because they're flourishing, because they're doing so well. I think that's one of the few times that a mainstream columnist in the New York Times was able to call out and suggest that maybe economic aid needs to be pulled back from the apartheid
Well, you also
state.
have Senator Bernie Sanders, who said we should condition the military aid to Israel, and you have other Congress people who are saying the same. Yeah, there is definitely a shift, not a large shift. Sadly, I still see a bipartisan Congress. They can fight against each other, almost want to kill each other over the elections in this country, over student loans, over the economy, over anything. But they line up, kowtowing to AIPAC, basically. Exactly, to AIPAC, to basically listen, not only to listen to Herzog's lies and misinformation, but also to pass a resolution, attesting, that they actually want to basically rewrite history and nullify or think they can exercise veto power. The United States can exercise veto power at the United Nations, but they want to have this global veto power saying, you know what? We don't believe the largest human rights organization in the world, like Human Rights Watch. We're not going to believe Amnesty International. We're not going to believe Israel's own human rights organization, who all concur that Israel is an apartheid state, because we're going to say Israel is not a racist or an apartheid state. I mean, this is kind of the farce, Jess.
Yeah, it is a farce. And remember, we have to understand that when thugs have their talking points, when they become particularly aggressive, and the thuggishness of AIPAC and the pro-Israel lobby, Jamal, they have their backs against the wall because of all the profound negative press that has been coming out. And it's not just that the patina or the farce or the illusion of Israel as a democratic state is falling apart. Let's also not forget the fact that since our last show, how many Palestinians have been murdered by settlers, colonial illegal settlers, and by the Israeli military? I mean, every day, children, men and women are being killed, shot, their land is being torched, they're being driven out from their indigenous homes and communities. So the fact that they have to pass the resolution is a reaction to the world condemnation. Now, it's not moving fast enough for you or I or for a lot of people in the social justice community, but the fact that they have to pass this resolution means, I believe, that the heat and the reality of the illusion of Israel is starting to break through.
Well, moving on to the next topic, when we are on this topic, let's talk about Bobby and the Israel lobby. And,
do we have to?
And I have to say, this title, I'm borrowing it from Max Blumenthal. We're talking here about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who began just like defining himself as, he's for peace and freedom. He's the strongest. He was denouncing neocons and warmongers. But then, at the same time, he's probably now, I wouldn't say the most, but he's one of the most zealous as defending Israel's military and justifying the occupation of Palestinian land, even denying that actually Palestinian land is that there is an occupation. So this whole thing, it doesn't make sense. Just because if
Sure
you
it
if you
does,
look if you
Jamal.
look at everything
Makes
like
sense.
that he says, of course, on one hand you'll say, maybe he's like is a kook. I mean, that's what I heard this description. He goes on talking about the origins of COVID-19, saying that there is an argument that the virus did not affect Ashkenazi Jews and people of Chinese descent, and as strongly as Caucasians and black people. I mean, he starts making up stuff as he goes on, defying science and so forth. And then I think the story began when he was a big supporter of Roger Waters, and then he turned against him, and now we see him resurfacing in the news when it comes now to Palestine and Israel, held by the hand by Rabbi Shmuley.
Rabbi Shmuley, right? That's right.
He calls himself America's Rabbi, Shmuley Botich. That's what he calls him. It's like a former reality show rabbi. Basically, he was recruited by your late Sheldon Adelson to advance the cause of Greater Israel within the United States.
It's kind of crazy, Jamal.
Adelson was the top funder of Trump 2016 and 2020 campaigns. Of course, Sheldon Adelson has passed, and so Shmuley likes to latch himself to something new, especially a celebrity. And actually, we talked about that earlier in the show with Silverstein. So I was listening again to his interview. And then at some point, that's why I said sometimes he just sounds like he's out of it. He's like referring to when he was like, went into a 20-minute diatribe, anti-Palestinian venom, Israeli propaganda. He was referring to hijabs as Habibs, and they didn't know how to pronounce Chechnya. I'm serious. Like, it's just like mumbling here and there. And then all of a sudden he turned against Iran and its nuclear weapons without mentioning that, of course, his beloved country, Israel, possesses a nuclear arsenal. He didn't talk about that.
Well, Jamal,
and he was referring. Listen, when he was kind of asked about what happened in Jenin. This is at the time when Israel was attacking Jenin by land and by air, basically by helicopters and jets and so forth. And he was saying that Jenin basically is a bomb factory, and that's why he was justifying the invasion, and that virtually 100% of the people there are supporting terrorism, and I'm quoting here.
Well, he sounds very anti-war and very progressive, I guess, right? No, I mean, it's a big joke, Jamal. We know that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. he's the only one that's kind of declared himself to be a Democrat to run against Joe Biden. He started out, as you said, as anti-war, anti-neocon, peace. And I guess it just took one crazy, really anti-Semitic comment for the pro-Israel kind of, forces to come out and do what they always do, Jamal. I mean, it's not breaking news, right? They're giving him a lot of money. They're supporting him right now, and he has to toe the line. And the line that he's towing is an Islamophobic, hateful, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian rhetoric, which, and I don't know if you read this part of it. Do you know who his biggest donors are right now?
His biggest donors?
Yeah.
Besides AIPAC?
Besides Shmuley and AIPAC are Republicans.
I'm sure of that, yeah.
Yeah, listen, he's not getting donations from Democrats. He's getting donations from right-wing MAGA types because he is talking the MAGA language. I mean, it's kind of the MAGA language, isn't
Well,
it?
it's
In
also
some
to
ways,
well, aside from this, it's to the advantage of the Republicans if he can split the party and take away the votes
exactly.
from President Biden, which is trying to do that. And of course, the Democrats are not going to support him, and he's getting his biggest donors and maybe his audience that he's addressing is the Republican Party. But like I said, he says things like this, and you know that those are talking points that were handed to him,
Schmollies.
to say. But then he goes on, and I cited earlier some examples, like he starts free associating, doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. And I'm just want to add to this, he starts talking about like, you have to listen to Israel. The Palestinians never wanted to have peace, and they're the ones who launched war in 1967, 1948, and blah, 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 all these things. And then he said, look what this, Syria got the Golan Heights, and Egypt got Sinai after they recognized Israel's right to exist. I'm not making this up, right? He said
He's so
Syria
crazy.
got the Golan Heights. Of course,
It's still
Israel
occupied.
annexed the Golan Heights during the Trump administration. And the Sinai Peninsula did not return to Egypt out of the goodness of the Israeli military or government. They basically went into a war,
And
and
lost.
Egypt liberated its territory from Israel's occupation through a surprise military campaign in 1973. So that tells me, when I listen to him, how uneducated about the topic, and how much does he stray. He doesn't have, because at some point, I think, I mean, who's his handlers? Who are his handlers?
He doesn't have a lot of handlers, Jamal. You know what
That
my feeling is? Let him talk.
and so when he talks, aside
Just
from the
let him
talking
talk.
points, he just
Let
makes
him.
up stuff, and there is no accountability. Nobody stops him and says, "Hey, what are you talking about? Israel occupies the Golan Heights. Why you're making this nonsense up?" But anyway, I think he is he's a disaster. I think he's a disaster to the Democratic Party, frankly. I mean, besides everything else, I think he's
I'm
a
not sure.
disaster.
I mean, he's a disaster. I'm just not sure it's going to really affect the election or the Democratic Party, to be honest.
Well,
But
there is a similar scenario like this because he gets a lot of mileage out of the Kennedy name, and this is what
yeah,
happened to Jimmy Carter in the primaries.
no,
Uh,
that's all
That
right. But at the same time, well, we'll
with
save this for
Teddy Kennedy. But anyway,
yeah, we'll save it for another show. But I don't think he poses a big a threat to Democrats as some people think. He may pose a bigger threat to Trump than he does to Joe Biden, but that's another story.
you
But
have to be crazy to vote for this guy, and
well, how many people voted for Donald Trump?
yeah, you're right. So I stand corrected. So moving on to the next story, just we started mentioning about this, you know, exaggerated. No, it's not an exaggerated. It's a really concentrated attack
Concentrated
on
attack.
Palestinian villagers and shepherds, and
Orchestrated too.
orchestrated and planned to take on more of their territory.
And burning.
Just because you talk about numbers, the United Nations, actually this was from last Friday, warned of a dramatic rise in West Bank settler attacks on Palestinian people and property, with nearly 600 such incidents registered so far this year. So this year, this is according to the UN humanitarian agency, OCHA. They said that it had recorded 591 settler-related incidents in the territory in the first 6 months of 2023, resulting in Palestinian casualties, property damage, or both. So that's an average of 99 incidents every month, and a 39% increase compared with the monthly average of the whole of 2022, which was at the time 71 incidents. And these are the ones that are documented and
Right.
recorded. So there
Right.
are, even the number is much higher, because not every time it gets documented and recorded. And this is happening with the encouragement of the fascist Israeli government, the Ben Gavirs, the Smotrich, and their ilk, basically rewarding these settler terrorists to you know, attack and invade
but
Palestinian
yeah,
land
but
and
look at
property.
exactly, Jamal. I mean, and they have said many times, especially after the invasion and destruction of Jenin, that Ben Gvir, Smotrich, Netanyahu said it was kind of a crazy statement. We're going to teach the they're we're mowing the grass. They say that again, that kind of awful, kind of grotesque, inhumane comment about mowing the grass in Palestine against Palestinians, which basically means ethnically cleansing them. And they have been given free range. Well, we remember that Benjamin Netanyahu has given Ben Gvir and Smotrich added powers, especially with their new um, paramilitary forces to support the illegal colonial settlers and their reign of terror against Palestinian civilians. It's really every day, Jamal. Palestinians are being attacked, killed, and their lands are being either burned or attempted to confiscated. And let's not forget, Jamal, the illegal colonial settlements are expanding at a rapid rate. Mali Adumin, I think, is going to, which is this huge, grotesque settlement around Jerusalem, is going to expand even more, Jamal. So this is a really, really, really painful, difficult, and, you know, uh, I mean, I'm putting it mildly, it's just a frightening time right now in Palestine, given that the settlers are running amok. Now, but bear with me for a minute, Jamal. Let's do a split screen. On the one hand, this is what the media is portraying in the United States: the brave Israeli demonstrators confronting Benjamin Netanyahu, right? It's
Right.
disgusting to see that. And everybody's coming out and saying, oh, we have to protect. I mean, where are these millions of Israelis, so called peace and democracy loving Israelis? Where have they been for 75 years? Where have they been? Where, I mean, they don't even know what's happening in their backyard, or they don't care, and they're not saying anything about it. And nor is the mainstream media. They talk about these heroic protesters protesting in Tel Aviv, while Palestinian villages are being burned, literally burned right now by these colonial settlers. It's really a grotesque
Well, the
portrayal.
type of demonstrations they're having, at least maybe for not all of them, but the vast majority, is to protect their rights as Jewish Israelis, but not the rights of Palestinians.
Precisely, and that's why this is a really dark time. I mean, for Palestine. I
Well,
mean,
listen. One of the latest incidents, because we're talking about these attacks, the killing of a 19-year-old Qusay Jamal Matan.
that's right.
So the shooting of Qusay Jamal Matan, it involves two of the settlers, Jess. One by the last name Indor, who is believed to be the person who shot the 19-year-old, and then his accomplice Yered, who interfered in the investigation. Both of them went there carrying M16, and then at the end of the day, this young man gets shot. Now they're in custody under investigation. We don't know what the Israeli authorities are going to do, but based on their prior history with the killing of the autistic young man,
Nothing will happen.
nothing happened. They basically
No.
exonerated the policeman or the border patrol who killed him, and I think it's going to be the same thing, and this scenario is going to repeat itself over and over again.
Well, I think that's exactly right, Jamal. It's just going to repeat itself. And we basically see that the US government, in the midst of the so called visa waiver program for Israeli settlers, for Israelis with, is moving forward, and it looks like it's going to happen. We don't know the final result yet, but it looks like it's going to happen. That this gruesome breach of I don't know what to call it, but wanton disregard for human Palestinian life, that illegal colonial settlers can go and wantonly kill Palestinian men, women, and children without any accountability, without any sense of justice or accountability. I mean, there hasn't been a single case where an Israeli who has killed a Palestinian has been held accountable. It just doesn't happen. Maybe they get arrested, maybe they're held for a few days, but eventually they're let go. Nothing ever happens. And you have Ben Gvir and Smotrich who are fanning the flames. And, basically, Jamal, it's kind of crazy to hear them say that. They go to the Haram Sharif, they'll go to the Al Aqsa Mosque, they'll walk, they'll provoke Palestinians, they will uproot Palestinian orchards, they will burn fields, they will kill Palestinians, and nothing will get done. So, Jamal, we're faced with another kind of, crazy world here where Israel will continue to get away with murder. It doesn't matter that it's not a democratic state. It doesn't matter that it's an apartheid state. Jamal, it doesn't even matter that Joe Biden doesn't like Benjamin Netanyahu, right? Because this thing transcends all of that. So this is a really dark time in Palestine.
Well, I mean, look at the record. No justice was brought to Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian American journalist who was killed.
Still.
And they just bury their heads, or look the other way. There was one exception this time, that the American embassy there condemned the killing of the 19-year-old Palestinian. But that's about it.
What? But it's meaningless words, Jamal. It's meaningless words because they continue to get $3.5–4 billion a year. They're going to get the visa waiver program. They're building illegal colonial settlements. They're killing Palestinians, and nothing gets done. So a condemnation from the State Department is actually meaningless. It's actually worse because it's just words that don't mean anything.
Well, one quick last story. There is a movie about Golda Meir.
Talk about rewriting history.
History, and then I see all these celebratory tweets and postings about her, how great of a woman she was, the first Israeli woman to lead the country, and so forth. And people don't know the history. I mean, this is so ludicrous to describe her in such fashion, kind of like the nice grandmother of Israel, the peace-loving
thug, Jamal. Woman. She was a thug.
Well, she was, number one, to begin with. She was a colonial settler, and people don't talk about that. Right. She was born Golda Mabovich in Kiev, Ukraine. As we talk, this is kind of like crazy. We keep getting all these people from Ukraine descending on Palestine and dictating what's going to happen there. But she was born in Kiev, Ukraine. Her family left. They came to the United States, to Milwaukee, basically, to Wisconsin. And then she immigrated to Palestine, held a Palestinian passport.
That's right.
And then later on, she said that Palestinians don't exist, and the word Palestine didn't exist. You could look at her immigration papers. She has her immigration paper coming to Palestine, holding a Palestinian passport, and she has a lot of things, to talk about. We don't have the time about her ugly history, but I'm gonna connect it to what's going on today when you see the settler attacks on the town of Aqraba and Hawara and all these places. They're in the same vicinity. But in the early 1970s, Golda Meir's government poisoned the lands of Aqraba in the West Bank to force the Palestinian villagers to clear the way to make an illegal settlement. She poisoned the water there. This is not our invention, Jess. This is from the Israeli media itself, and
That's
from documentation and archives in the government.
Well, this is the classic rewriting of history yet again. But I anticipate that a lot of people will confront this revisionist history, Jamal, because she was responsible for killing a lot of Palestinians, for the theft of a lot of Palestinian land. She has a lot of blood on her hands still. And we're not going to stop to tell the truth about who Golda Meir was, irrespective of whatever documentary they make of her. So, yeah. Not a time to celebrate Golda Meir's thuggery in Palestine, but I'm sure we'll hear more about it.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we will talk to you next week.
See you next week.